In 1968, the Netherlands drained part of the sea for a factory that was never built. For most people, it was simply empty land. But biologist Frans Vera saw something else. At first, 32 head of cattle were released onto the territory. Then horses and deer were added. And suddenly, within a few years, the land began coming back to life on its own. Rare birds returned, wetlands expanded, and the area began to be called one of the most successful conservation projects in Europe. But the success unexpectedly became a trap. Animal populations grew, and in winter they died in their thousands from hunger and cold. What had once looked like a conservation utopia became one of the loudest ecological scandals in the Netherlands. In 1968, the Dutch drained part of southern Flevoland. The land was intended for factories. The economy changed faster than the bulldozers could arrive. The plot was left empty, and within a few years it had turned into a marsh with the richest bird diversity in the country. Dutch biologist Frans Vera looked at this land and saw evidence for a theory that most of his colleagues considered heretical. The prevailing view held that, without humans, ancient Europe would have been an unbroken forest from the Atlantic to the Urals, with tree canopies closing overhead for thousands of kilometers. Vera doubted it. He believed that large herbivores, aurochs, wisent, and wild horses had shaped the landscape themselves, preventing the forest from closing and creating a mosaic of pastures and groves. No evidence for this idea existed, so Vera proposed something nobody had tried at such a scale: to recreate this mechanism artificially and see what happened. Vera started from an inconvenient question posed by pollen data. If the ancient forests of Europe were a solid closed canopy, why do light-demanding oak and hazel appear so abundantly in fossil soil layers? Something must have kept the forest open, and the only candidate for that role was large herbivores. This was not merely an armchair theory. Vera secured a position in the State Forestry Service and spent years pushing for the idea to be tested in the field. The abandoned polder of Oostvaardersplassen became the ideal test site. Large, fenced, unclaimed. No supplementary feeding, no predators. Let's see whether nature finds its own balance. Everything began with geese. When grey-leg geese colonized the abandoned polder before any human intervention, Vera and the colleagues who joined him watched as the birds themselves transformed reed beds into shallow pools, and other bird species immediately colonized these new areas. That observation suggested the idea: if geese could reshape the landscape on their own, what might larger herbivores do? Vera himself later described the moment of transition from observation to theory directly. The prevailing view held that to prevent pasture from reverting to forest, you needed cattle, and to have cattle, you needed farmers to herd and tend them. Vera challenged precisely this dependency. It pushed me to think, if domestic cows can maintain a pasture, why can't wild cows do the same? The first challenge was practical: where to find animals that nobody herds. Heck, cattle were not chosen by chance. They were a breed German zoologists had developed in the 1920s and 30s, attempting through backbreeding to recreate the extinct aurochs. They proved hardy enough to live without human care. In 1983, 32 head were brought to the site. The following year, 18 Konik horses from Poland were added. In 1992, 52 red deer from Scotland and Central Europe were introduced. The first years showed that the cattle and horses kept the grass short for the geese, but left untouched the elder bushes that had begun spreading at the edges of the bogs. The deer were brought in precisely for this. They eat what neither cattle nor horses will touch. Each new species closed a specific gap left by the previous one. The Konik horses arrived at the reserve from Polish farms where humans had been making decisions for them for millennia: when to eat, where to stand, whom to stay with. In the reserve, those decisions returned to the animals themselves. In a domestic herd, the leading role is traditionally assigned to the stallion. In the semi-wild Konik herds, everything is different. Movement of the herd is led by the most experienced mare. She knows where the water is, where shelter from the wind is, where the grass survived the dry autumn. the stallion stays at the edge, not a leader but a guardian, tracking threats and keeping the herd together. Conflicts between stallions are resolved with almost no physical contact. Two males freeze facing each other, display posture, walk parallel, and one eventually retreats. The wild allows no reserves for injury. A lame stallion is a dead stallion by the following winter. While the horses were relearning behavior that centuries of domestication had driven out of them, another change was happening in the reserve, unnoticed. The deer proved perfectly adapted to the reserve's conditions, with a more varied diet, a more efficient stomach for low-quality forage, and stable breeding even in hard years. Without wolves, the only predator that naturally keeps deer in check in this part of Europe, and with no possibility of migration, each generation simply remained in the reserve. By January 2015, the reserve held approximately 250 head of cattle and 1,200 horses. Deer numbered 3,200. The reserve had crossed the natural carrying capacity threshold back in 2008. But without a limiting mechanism, the population did not stabilize. It simply fluctuated, expanding in warm years and falling sharply in cold ones. The reserve that had begun as an equal experiment between three species was imperceptibly becoming a country of deer. And the deer would be the first to feel the consequences. Birds not seen in this part of the Netherlands for decades began nesting in the bogs. The territory was recognized as a wetland of international importance in 1989. Scientists from around the world came to look at a reserve compared to the African Serengeti, just an hour's drive from Amsterdam. The het cattle were breeding. This was proof, but it proved to be a trap. The winter of 2005 was the first cold warning. Around 34% of the het cattle died of starvation, the highest mortality rate the reserve had seen to that point. Media published photographs and video of animals dying. Rangers could not euthanize them quickly enough to reduce suffering. The head of the Council for Animal Affairs called the reserve a concentration camp in a newspaper article. In the Dutch parliament, a member discussing the 2005 mortality peak formulated the position that would become the front line for the next decade. It is better to let nature take its course without intervention, on the condition that natural equilibrium eventually arrives. What happened in the year after the first mass death, nobody had planned. On May 22, 2006, the Netherlands announced news the country had not heard in all of modern history. A pair of white-tailed eagles had nested and raised chicks in Oostvaardersplassen. The birds had come on their own, without any reintroduction program, simply finding a place with enough food. And the food was the carcasses of animals that had died of starvation that same year. Scientists who later studied the phenomenon confirmed that an animal carcass decomposing in place does not merely feed birds and foxes, it returns to the soil the nutrients the animal had accumulated over years. At the site of decomposition, denser and more diverse vegetation grows. Insects follow, and birds follow the insects. What society perceived as pure tragedy turned out simultaneously to be a mechanism generating new life. The problem was that equilibrium did not arrive. It simply alternated with new peaks of mortality each time the population grew large enough to hit the land's carrying capacity again. The government asked an international panel of experts for an assessment. The commission published a report in 2006, allowing the experiment to continue under certain conditions, more shelter for the animals, and a research program. The recommendations were partially adopted. When the economic recession of 2008 hit budgets, plans to expand the reserve, which would have given animals more land for natural migration, were canceled as too expensive. In 2013, the documentary film The New Wilderness about Oostvaardersplassen was released, winning recognition as one of the best Dutch films of the year. It showed the public an image of wild nature an hour's drive from Amsterdam, compelling and cinematic, and as it would emerge within a few years, incomplete. In December 2017, the number of large herbivores in the reserve reached nearly 5,300, 700 more than the year before. Roughly one animal per hectare of land. Enough, it seemed. The winter turned out to be cold and wet. The grass stopped growing earlier than usual. By the end of the season, more than 3,000 animals had died of starvation or been shot by rangers to spare them from prolonged suffering. That was nearly 60% of the reserve's entire population. Train passengers could see horse carcasses directly from the windows. Photographs of emaciated animals spread through social media faster than any official explanation could catch up. In February 2018, a rider named Cynthia Danvers came to the reserve. She saw something she would not forget. "I had never seen such thin horses," she recalled afterward. "We saw so many dead animals. It was unbelievable." Danvers filed a lawsuit against the State Forestry Service together with her friend Annemiek van Straten. Not against the idea of returning wild animals to the landscape, against the way that idea was being carried out in practice. The dispute extended far beyond the courtroom and scientific discussions. Vera himself was publicly compared to Hitler. He received death threats by letter. Threats were even made against his grandchildren. Rangers and ecologists who tended the animals daily also received threats for not feeding animals that the very premise of the project forbade them to feed. Neither side of this conflict considered itself cruel. Each believed it was protecting the animals from the other side. Han Olf, professor of ecology at the University of Groningen, saw in the conflict not science versus misfortune, but human expectations versus animal biology. "Death occurs when population growth reaches the limit of what the land can support," he said. "Would you put a ban on nature on an island?" Others saw it differently. Dutch people accustomed to horses as pets did not see a natural process. They saw cruelty committed by an organization that should have known better. Neither side was entirely right. Neither was entirely wrong. Official statistics from the State Forestry Service Staatsbosbeheer for the 5 months from December 2016 to April 2017 record 2,684 red deer, 75 head of cattle, and 467 horses that died in a single season. This occurred the year before the catastrophic winter of 2017 to 2018 that train passengers witnessed, meaning mass mortality was not a one-time anomaly. It repeated. Flevoland Province established a commission under Peter van Giel to review the reserve's management policy. The report was presented in April 2018 and adopted in July of that year. The commission's conclusion was clear. The experiment of pure non-intervention was over. Rather than allowing food supply to regulate animal numbers, the reserve moved to active management with fixed population targets, approximately 500 deer, 210 heck cattle, and 550 conic horses. This figure is less than 1/10 of the 2017 peak. The activists did not stop at protests. The case reached the highest administrative court in the Netherlands for matters of economic law, the Trade and Industry Appeals Tribunal. On September 7, 2021, the court issued a final ruling. The court said the large herbivores and Oostvaardersplassen live in the wild rather than being kept by humans, and therefore the rules governing farm animals do not apply to them. The State Forestry Service fulfills its duty of care toward the animals within the bounds of the law. The ruling confirmed what lower courts had already determined, and meant that in practice, the reserve's management model would not change fundamentally as a result of further litigation. Veterinarians now regularly assess the condition of the animals. Records of these assessments, reports on the body condition index of each herd, are published by the province in publicly accessible form several times a month. This is not the experiment Vera began. It is a compromise between his idea and Dutch society, which refused to watch animals die in front of train windows. The marshy section of the reserve also began to be managed differently. In autumn 2021, the water level in the reserve's largest water area was lowered to its lowest point in the entire observation period, and a large section of the lakebed was exposed, becoming a temporary haven for migrating birds searching for food in shallow water. The marsh vegetation gained space to expand. Once the required area of reedbed is achieved, the water level will be raised again, a managed cycle instead of the randomness Vera had planned. The question that never received a final answer was this: was the failure in Vera's idea itself, or in how it was implemented? The reserve was meant to be connected by a corridor to the Veluwe forest, so that animals could migrate when food supplies in one place ran out. That corridor was never built. The economic crisis of 2008 canceled the expansion plans. The fence remained a fence, and 56 square kilometers proved too small to sustain its own theory without catastrophe. There is even a legal benchmark for this contradiction. According to an explanatory note to the Nature Protection Law, animals in a fenced territory are considered wild if the territory exceeds 5,000 hectares and provides sufficient food. Oostvaardersplassen is approximately 5,600 hectares. The reserve barely crossed the threshold distinguishing wild nature from a holding pen in the eyes of the law, not by a wide margin, but literally by a few hundred hectares. This is the core of the contradiction. laid bare to its finest detail. The same horse can be either wild, with the right to die of starvation, or held, with the right to protection, depending solely on which side of a fence it happens to be standing on at a given moment. Vera remains convinced that mass starvation death is not a failure but a mechanism of nature that people are simply unaccustomed to seeing up close. His critics say something different. A natural process enclosed within artificial limits, without predators and without any path of escape, is no longer natural. It merely looks that way on video. Neither side has yielded. The reserve still exists. Management still balances between intervention and its absence. The question, how much control can be added to wild nature before it stops being wild, remains open not only for the Netherlands. Today, Oostvaardersplassen holds approximately 1,100 large herbivores, less than a fifth of the peak that preceded the catastrophe. Less grass is eaten, and more has time to grow. The animals, according to the latest veterinary assessments, are in good physical condition. Shooting continues every winter, as routine population management, the same as in any other nature reserve in the Netherlands. In autumn 2025, independent researchers from Wageningen University completed a scientific assessment of the reserve's entire management policy, commissioned by the province. The conclusion was measured without triumphant declarations. The reduction in animal numbers and the management of water levels have had a positive effect, but too little time has passed to state definitively that the reserve's nature is genuinely recovering in the long term. Years of additional observation are needed. This is not the answer either side of the former dispute had been waiting for. Not a vindication of Vera's idea of complete non-intervention. Not a final confirmation that the critics were entirely right. The land reclaimed from the sea for factories that were never built still stands green, with horses grazing where factory floors were meant to be. The geese that first colonized the abandoned polder in 1968 still return there every year. What began as a mistake in industrial planning became one of the longest natural experiments in Europe, still unfinished, still under observation, and still without a final answer to the question Vera posed half a century ago. Can wild nature find its own balance if we simply leave it alone?